Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. My name is Stephen Hunt. And I'll be your host for today's session. I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn and to join our LinkedIn group to stay in touch with us regarding upcoming events, new software releases, and new exciting capabilities that are just on the horizon. Additionally, I invite you to visit the Software and Resource Hub on our website, which is a great resource for any additional information. Today's webinar will not be a product sales demo, but I do want to take a moment to make you aware of Safran's project risk analysis and risk management tools, Safran Risk and Safran Risk Manager. Please reach out to me if you would like any information on either tool, would like to discuss your pain points with your current tools and processes, or would like links to resources, webinars, or even a trial version of the software. There will be many great webinars this year. Please watch for announcements on LinkedIn and via email. I hope to see you and your colleagues at any of the upcoming webinars. In addition to the webinar series, we will have a series of in-person Safran conferences planned this year. If you are in or near any of these locations, I hope you'll come out to join us for a day of learning and networking. Again, keep an eye on LinkedIn and your email for announcements. Dr. Hulett will be leading today's webinar. He needs no introduction as he is a well-known and respected thought leader throughout the project risk analysis world. It is our honor to have him kick off this year's webinar series. Again, please don't hesitate to reach out to him with any questions you have after the webinar. Dr. Hulett is widely credited for developing the risk driver method. This method is the focus of today's session. The method focuses on identifying the specific risks that drive cost and schedule uncertainty. I hope you're ready for a highly educational session. Without further ado, I turn the platform over to Dr. Hulett. All right, Dr. Hulett, it's all yours, sir.
Look, I really appreciate the opportunity, Steve, that Safran has given me to present some material for this group, and I appreciate people in the group to have carved out some time to actually attend this and to listen to what we have to say. This is a masterclass segment on quantitative risk analysis using risk drivers and generating activity duration correlation in Safran Risk. And the reason I have chosen this is in part because I'm the principal author of AACE's recommended practice 57R09, and that is I developed that in 2011, and then in 2019 when I updated it, I added the words using risk drivers as part of the title of the recommended practice. We are now engaged in another update, but the title of using risk drivers will continue to be in the title. So I thought that maybe it would be a good idea to start out the sessions that we're having with Safran's kind support to do that. Let me show you, start a little bit earlier, and that is with qualitative risk analysis. And this will indicate some of the important advances that risk drivers give us in their use and all that. But this is a qualitative risk analysis. It's a heat map. Heat maps are supported by Safran Risk Managers as well, as Stephen has mentioned in the earlier slide. But what the impacts are, the probability is about the same. You know, the probability is the same kind of definition that we've always had, which actually goes back to David Hilson's work, where he says it's uncertainty that matters. So what the probability is the probability that this risk will occur on this project with some impact. Doesn't have to be large impact, could be opportunity or threat, but whatever it is, it's got to have some impact. But that's the same for risk drivers too, so we can put that aside now. But it's the impact that's the difference. That's the difference. And in qualitative risk analysis, you remember they don't have a schedule, or maybe they have a schedule, but they're not using it. And so they have rules, guidance that they give to the people who are in the risk workshops that impact moderate, high, and very high, for instance, might gain a risk, a red or high assessment, depending upon the probability, of course. But this impact, and this is the important point, this impact is if the risk occurs, how will the finish date of the schedule, and let's say we're doing it for schedule, how will the finish date of the schedule be affected? And you can see right away that there's a huge jump between what the risk does, which is to modify the durations of activities that it affects, to come to the conclusion as to what's going to happen for the finish date. And you don't know what's going to happen for the finish date because it doesn't have a concept of critical path or near critical path or risk critical path or any of those things. It goes right to the fact that if this happens, the finish date will gain 20 days or 10 days or 20 minutes. I don't know what it will gain. Okay, and so this analysis is often used as a guide to use scarce risk mitigation funds on the red risks too. I've got clients who take this and look at the red risks and they say, okay, we can start mitigating those right away. The problem with that is that the identity of the risks that are most impactful cannot be determined by this until you look at the way that the screen, the way that the logic and the durations of the schedule actually commit the impact from the activities to the finish date. I've underlined this is way too early in the analytical process to start mitigating. The risks that use scarce mitigation resources may not be the most impactful because we haven't looked at the schedule logic. We haven't looked at the importance of parallel paths and near critical paths and things like that will tend to augment or deaden the impact of any particular risk on the finish date. It just is making a blind assumption of the finish date. Here's the type of guidance we might have. I'm just looking at the schedule. I don't know if you can see my mouse over here, but the schedule is sort of taken like this. Here's the anything less than 10% is a very low impact. By the way, this should be developed by the project manager who's responsible for not only managing the project, but communicating the project to other people. And he or she will have their own information and their own opinion for this particular project as to how many days they want to claim as being moderate or high or very high impact. And again, they don't know whether it will happen. They are making an assumption that if the risk happens, and then they jump to the final result, and they say, okay, if that's the case, then we're going to have a 60-day or a 40-day or a 20-day impact, and that they just don't know. They don't know that. So what we have to do is to wait until we've gotten the quantitative risk analysis completed, and then try to look and see which ones are the most important risks there. Okay, so by the way, sometimes the qualitative risk analysis range, say 21 to 40, is developed as a 3-point estimate for an expected value type simulation from the qualitative risk analysis. But again, that has the same problems that I've just said, because you don't know whether something that happens now might affect the finish date, which could be 2, 3, 4 years later. A lot of things happen. A lot of other activities are involved. So that's the problem. It's with the impact designation in the risk qualitative risk analysis. But then suppose we get to the quantitative risk analysis and people say, okay, well, what are the what are the activities that the risk will affect if it happens? Now we've got activities, so that's a good idea. Well, and a lot of people say, and they continue to say, we will apply risk days added if the risk occurs to the activities. But how do we apply days added on the finish date if the risk occurs to the activities? Well, maybe we go to the activities and we say it'll affect these activities, the risks that affect the activities. And we say, well, all right, well, should we put all the days added on one activity? If so, which one? I mean, maybe the end of the path if you've got a path, but then that sort of avoids the question of the merge bias and all that happens in the middle of project schedule. Or you might choose a candidate activity. I remember doing one a long time ago where I said, okay, well, let me take the activity, it's going to affect maybe 20 activities. Let me take the one with the lowest total float, indicating that, hey, maybe I take the activity with the lowest total float and put all the days on it, 10 days, 20 days, 40 days. Maybe that will have the best chance possible for this risk to have an impact. Okay, well, that's again, you're avoiding the problem. The problem is that you're not letting the risk affect the activity's duration that are affected by that risk itself. So you're still trying to forecast the finish date with these risks that you are applying. Or you can spread the days and their ranges over all candidate activities. Maybe you've got 20 activities, and so a range that has been decided is plus 10 days, plus 20 days, plus 40 days if it's a triangular distribution. But if you put all those days, how do you do it? Do you put all those days on every one of them, or do you split them up in terms of 20 activities, so 10 days? The optimistic case, the most optimistic case would be to add half a day to each one of them, and the most likely case would be to add 1 day to each one of them because it's a 20-day activity. There are 20 activities, and all that. So, but the answer there is that if you want to put the risk information on these activities, you've got to have a reason. And if you're using days added, which is a very common approach, then you have to figure out how to split those days into the impact on the various activities that it's supposed to affect. And Safran has options for this if you want to do it that way. But as I say, if you spread them out like butter on a piece of toast, the ranges will be low, but would be almost the information would be almost lost because those are very, very tiny numbers and all that. So basically, expressing the impact of the risk on the finish date of the schedule is just awkward. You either jump to the finish date or you go to putting days added to the activities that are affected, and yet on the other hand, it doesn't seem to work. So I mentioned risk drivers, and I think Steve mentioned something about it. So let's just here's the birth of an idea. In about 2007, a colleague of mine, Wayland Whitehead, and I were performing risk analysis on the Yanbu export refinery project for ConocoPhillips in partnership with Saudi Aramco. It's a new greenfield plant, and they were doing that. ConocoPhillips has since gotten out of that. I think Total is the one that actually finished it with Saudi Aramco. But right now, it's ConocoPhillips. Well, ConocoPhillips wanted to show the impact of ranges to reflect percentages of the original data used. And why I say original data instead of duration is because at that point, ConocoPhillips had used the percentages as original data only on cost. So there would be cost, and then one up to the optimistic might be adding 10% to the total cost of a particular cost breakdown item, or 30% or 50% or something like that if it happened. Again, with the probability being involved. So we contacted Primavera, which at that time had acquired PertMaster a year before. And we got in touch with a very bright gentleman named Rusty Johnson. And he was actually packing up his Primavera office, and I think maybe going into his own garage or something. But he agreed to help us. And so he, over a period of two or three weeks, the files were going back and forth between the United States and the UK. My contribution was to say, wait a minute, since these are risks, they really need to have a probability of occurring as well, because all risks have a probability of occurring as well as an impact. And ConocoPhillips didn't care about that. They were going to just make the impact based upon multiplicative factors of the duration of the activities, and therefore implicitly saying every risk is 100% likely to occur. But I'm proud to say that my contribution was adopted by Rusty Johnson, produced a module called risk factors, the risk factors module. It did not even ship with the new copies of Primavera Risk Analysis for a while, so I had to send my own copy of the risk factors module to my clients, because otherwise they wouldn't have it. And I think it's true. I think I heard as a rumor that Rusty said that this was the best contribution he had made in his years with PertMaster. Okay, and he's still, and by the way, Rusty Johnson is still advising Safran. So Safran has a lot of things. The first thing I said to Safran when I met them 10 years ago or so was, do you have risk drivers? And they said, oh, don't worry about that. Rusty Johnson is guiding us as one of our advisors, paid or not paid, I don't know, but we're one of our advisors. And so I felt very confident that risk drivers would be in Safran, and of course it is. Definitions. Well, here's a definition that maybe we can use. Risk drivers affect scheduled duration of the activities that they influence, every one of them. And it may be that the importance of a risk is the number of activities that they impact. The impacts are expressed as multipliers of those scheduled durations. Or remaining durations if it's a project that's ongoing, and so the remaining durations are the only things you can affect on some activities. Turns out that it is much easier to develop the impact ranges of risks when you're talking about the activities they literally directly affect, and let the logic of the schedule and the durations and the logic ties and all that of the schedule be determined by the simulation of the project schedule that is now risk informed, but risk informed at a level, at a place where the risk impacts can be identified as well as we can for the future on activities that are right next to the risk. Here's the risk. It's a risk on piping for a process plant. Well, we know where the activities are for the pipings, and so we know if we're going to have a risk, we're going to apply those to all those activities in the piping phase, and that's real easy. Rather much easier than trying to figure out, well, if the piping phase is affected in some way by the risk, what would be the finish date? You just can't answer that question. This is a question you can answer. So risk drive is affecting multiple activities. We will have the ability then to use the risk drivers with the multiplicative factors to all the activities it affects easily. We don't have the question again about, well, how do you spread the days added? We don't do that because we have a different way to do it. Let me just talk a little bit about what risk drivers really do. And here's two models of activities that are either in parallel or in series. And what I mean by that is that suppose you have a you got some construction going on, and there's a huge crane that you probably rent, and the crane breaks. Now, there may be some other things going on, but fundamentally, if the crane breaks, then everything stops until you can get a new crane or you repair the existing one. And once that is done, then there may be some other risks that have to be developed, but there's no sense in doing that until you have survived the impact. And that's what the risk factors represent, is the impact of a risk that happens in the iteration in which it happens. And so risk one, which has, let's say, for a particular iteration, has a 1.2 factor. That is, if it happens, that particular iteration, that particular activity is 20% longer than it was in the schedule. And then there's another activity which has a 1.1 factor, which is waiting for you to survive the crane breaking. Well, if you're doing them in series, and this is the software's default, the factor for that particular iteration would be 1.2 times 1.1 or 1.32. On the other hand, and go down a little further below, sometimes the risks can be recovery from the risk can be accomplished simultaneously. And so, for instance, 1.2 is no longer the crane breaking, but it is a risk that if it happens, we have to survive it. That's what the risk is. It's not mitigating the risk. It is actually surviving a risk that has happened. And the risk 2 is still 1.1, but if they're entered in parallel, then only the longest factor multiplier on a particular activity for a particular iteration, it works. So therefore, I get a 1.2 factor for that particular iteration. So if it's in series, which, as I say, is the default option, you get it 1.32. If it's in parallel, you get 1.2 for these particular two risks. And you can see right away that that if you have many risks, the multiplicative factor can end up getting for a particular iteration a very large multiplier. On the other hand, if you have them in parallel, all you're looking for is the one which has chosen from its distribution of multipliers the longest factor to be applied to that activity for that particular iteration. Just for fun, this is the export of the risk mappings template from Saffron Risk, and you'll see these are activities in a particular case study that I have, and these are all in series. Now, I would not want to go into that and change some of those to parallel, but you might want to do that. On the other hand, you can do a global change and say, if it has capital SERIES, which the syntax is very important, delete it and replace it with parallel, PARALLEL, capital P, and all that. All of a sudden, all these will change to parallel, and you will get the things that look like 1.32 rather than the impacts that look like 1.2. Okay. So now here's another thing I want to mention. We might get to this in later sessions as well. Do not count on the risk register to include all important risks. In fact, I always find, every single time, I find that when we do some data collection on the risks, and this is on the risk register now that maybe has developed in Microsoft Excel or Active Risk Manager or some other program, maybe Saffron Risk Manager. I find that the risk registers do not include some of the most important risks. You're looking at the good and the bad and the ugly. And look at the good and bad and the ugly risks. And the ugly risks are, guess what? They are probably not going to be discussed too much in the risk data collection workshop, or they're going to be undervalued in the workshop because there are a lot of pressures, biases, and groupthink in the workshop. And there's some people who are so worried about the repercussions to themselves in case they talk about a risk that really is ugly for the project, that they will be invited to leave the meeting and never come back. So what they do is they sit in the back of the room and wait for the pizza to be delivered at lunchtime, and don't talk, even though they have concerns about various risks. What we do is we collect data doing confidential risk interviews. And we like these are with the team leads, we with the project managers. I had one where the project manager on a gas pipeline came to one of these confidential risk interviews, and he said, "Look, I've got three risks that I want to talk about." He talked about three risks. This is a project manager. Turned out they were not on his own risk register, but they were so impactful that they became, among others, with the risk analysis and the capability to prioritize risk later on, they became of the top 10 risks, they became 3 of the top 10, or maybe 3 of the top 5. I've forgotten. Another guy came in on an aerospace project, and he talked about 3 risks in 2 hours. And he said, when he was leaving, he said, "Now I got to come back tomorrow because I got 2 more risks." None of those 5 risks were on the risk register. The dynamics of the way the risk register is collected, and I think it has something to do with the workshops, are such that some of these risks aren't even mentioned, much less are they discussed. For instance, suppose one of the risks is that the company should have hired Bechtel or Jacobs or somebody to manage the project because the company doesn't understand project management. Well, now who wants to actually go into a risk workshop and try to introduce and defend that particular risk? I mean, he or she will be shouted down immediately and probably asked to go out into the corridor, and we don't talk about that risk, or we don't talk about the 5 risks that have implications for the owner who is actually paying the bills for the risk analysis. Okay, so fundamentally, we've got confidential risk interviews. The risk interviews take 2 hours as opposed to keeping you away from your desk for 12 hours, for 8 hours during a one-day workshop. Nobody seems to care for that comparison, because the number of hours of people in the company spent on the contract may not be credited to the particular project. But in fact, 2 hours is shorter. They get to go back to their office and do other work. Whereas if they figure out, well, I went to this risk workshop, that's going to take 12 days. It's going to take 8 hours, and maybe I have travel time and all that. So this is good all around. But the exciting part is that you get better data. Another benefit is that people who are interviewed really appreciate being interviewed. And here's my little. It's an offshore gas production platform. I did a lot of risk analysis of a number of these for Petronas some time ago. And you got decision making, engineering, procurement, fabrication. Look at the fabrication, it's 300 days. We'll take a look at that. These are units that are being fabricated at vendor shops and then shipped to site. Installation, watch out for the weather in Southeast Asia. You've got a weather calendar as well. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. And this is the sort of thing that you might come out with. We got interviewee number 1, and say there are 50 risks in the risk register, and I'll tell you that many of those risks are yellow and even green. And you say, well, wait a minute, what happened to the red risk? This is a very complicated project, and you find out then either that they were underestimated or they've been mitigated. So we don't know what they were before they were mitigated. Oh, by the way, mitigation costs money. The mitigation money has been spent based upon the qualitative analysis. See the other slide. Okay, so lack of experienced labor, and that could even be broken down further into there are a lot of other projects in the same neighborhood who use the same type of labor, and we will have trouble getting field labor across. So fabrication productivity may not be as high as planned. Fabrication may take longer than planned. And then interviewee number 1 says, well, what is this? What happens to this? And he says, well, it's 70% likely to happen on this project. And we say, okay, what is the impact? Well, now I'm in the next slide, I'm going to show you how he did it. But he said the minimum is 100%. And what does 100% mean? Remember, I said it is the multiplicative factor on the remaining duration, or the total duration of the projects, of the activities that it's been assigned to. And then 115% for the most likely and 140% for the maximum. And I hear somebody in the back of the room, I'm sorry I can't see your face, but somebody in the back of the room says, that's wrong. That's wrong, because the most likely has to be 100. It has to be the number in the database. And I say, well, I don't think that's right. Not necessarily, because this person anyway thought that the duration estimates were the very, very minimum. They were being viewed as what it should take rather than what it will take. And he or she is saying, well, on the other hand, the most likely is that it'll take 15% longer. And the maximum is it could take 40% longer, but don't insist that the most likely be the 100%, the 100% answer, which means that the minimum one has to be the 95 or 90% answer opportunity of occurring. But the reason is that the estimates might be, at least for these activities, might be biased. But by the way, confidential interviews can now represent systemic risk consistent with AACE definitions volume, which is voluminous indeed, 10S90. And it now says there's an option for the use in Monte Carlo simulation. Systemic risks, of which there may be multiple instances, may have any probability of occurrence. This is a change, because up until a couple of years ago, anytime you deal with a systemic risk, it was insisted that the systemic risk would be 100% likely. Well, now remember, it's 100% likely. Well, the percentage is, what is the likelihood? What is the likelihood that this risk will have some impact? And so I've just ignored that, and I've used systemic risk all I need to, and at the same time said, well, they could be 70% or 50% or 20%. In this particular case study, I've got it at 20%. Okay, now you say, look, one of the benefits of using risk drivers, because you're using the multiplicative factors, is that you can easily apply the risk to multiple activities, including, in this case, all to the fabrication activities. Or if you're talking about field construction, it could be a field construction activity, or it could be engineering. I've got a project recently in mind where there were 900 activities associated with engineering, and they were having troubles. Well, okay, how do I get that information? Remember, I told you that fabrication was scheduled to be 300 days. It's in the future, so we don't know what it really will cost. That's about 10 months. Okay, that's about 10 months. So then somebody says, well, here's this risk about the fabrication productivity. And you're the first interviewee who's described that. So you're going to see me type these things in and make sure that I am typing faithfully to what you're telling me. Okay, so here's a question. I'd say, look, this is such an overarching risk. Fabrication productivity goes on until fabrication's done. What would happen to the 10-month duration of the phase? Because we're going to apply that to all the activities in the phase. What would happen to the 10-month duration? They say, well, the 10-month might squeeze through, but most likely it's going to be, 12 months. And pessimistically, with everything going crazy, it'll be instead of 10 months, it'll be 16 months. Now that person is indicating risks to all those activities that ultimately have 10 months, 12 months, or 15 or 16, whatever I just said. Okay, now, well, that's interesting. By the way, we're asking a number of people this. The first person, there were 50, this is an Excel spreadsheet. There were 50 activities in the risk register, and they're all available to any individual who comes into these risk interviews. I will tell you And we asked them to come in with 5 risks that they really want to talk about. And often those 5 risks are not anywhere to be seen on the risk register, but they're highly excited about those risks. And so the first person gave me the 70% likely 100, 115, 140 for the entire fabrication phase. And you know that that's going to be applied to all those fabrication activities. So it's going to add to the 300 days, 15% and 40% for the most likely. And then, of course, something is pulled from, some multiplier is pulled from that distribution. By the way, I'm using now a lot more uniform distributions because I don't like the fact that triangular distributions have almost no probability down to the minimum and out to the maximum. They just you may not get any probability that is meaningful. Oh, look, I've got a lot of thumbs up on that one. Anyway, I like to use a uniform distribution where the probability is equal through the whole distribution. And these are just people, and say they will. So the first person will say, "Here's the lack of experienced labor for the reasons that I mentioned." Okay, here's the risk. I will call that. I will take as a format my Excel workbook, and tab number 1 will be the names of the interviewees as they appear in my doorstep to spend 2 hours with me. Nobody sees that but me, but it helps me. And then we got one, and the first one was lack of experienced labor, and that was risk 51. Okay, now the second interviewee comes in. He doesn't even know who the first interviewee was, or he might. But I have tab number 2. Tab number 1 was interviewee number 1, and all the information that he got is in tab number 1. Well, interviewee number 2 is going to see all those risks that were included, which means all the risk register risks if you want to talk about them, but everything that interviewee number 1 said, but he doesn't know who interviewee number 1 is. And we copy the whole spreadsheet for interviewee number 1 from his tab, create a new tab, paste that into the new tab, and delete all the data that came from interviewee number 1. So they're blank data, but all the new risks are there. And interviewee number 2 says, "Hey, yeah, I want to talk about that one. Please let me talk about that one. I got 5 risks, but let's talk about the fabrication productivity." So you see that everybody who sees that has an opportunity to chime in on that particular risk. And some of these it says, like the company has never done anything of this size before, and they're using a lot of new technology. That is a very heavy risk on the schedule and also on the cost. You wouldn't be surprised to find that we had 25 out of the 40 people we interviewed. 25 of them wanted to talk about that risk because it was so obvious to them. And guess what? None of them would have talked about it in a risk workshop. Okay, and this is just another thing. The risk import template. This is the data Excel spreadsheet exported and with all this kind of information. All right, now, by the way, what did I do? I have taken these risks, and I have said, look, here are 5 different people responding to a particular risk. You might have 2 or 3, or you may have 10 or 20, whatever it is. I want to treat them equally, assuming that they understood what the exercise was, and assuming that they are not exhibited any bias that I don't want to have included in my data gathering. But look, I mean, this is not unlikely. Probability anywhere from 75 down to 40%, but each one of them is given the honor and the privilege of being treated equally with everybody else. They were in the room by themselves. giving information that they have, and they're giving impacts as well as probabilities, and to treat them all with respect and equal. I averaged the numbers. So none of them had 64%, 93%, 108, 132, but the group, it's not exactly law of large numbers because these are not large numbers of them, but it's essentially the wisdom of crowds. It's essentially the people who have spent a lot of time, 2 hours with me, and deserve to be counted on any risk that they claim to have an interest in. They might be introducing new risks in addition to commenting on previous risks, but that's the dynamics of a mitigation exercise. We figure we could do four interviews in a day. So you got 20 interviews in a week, and then maybe there are 2 of you, so you got 40 interviews, and then you're going to consolidate them. Okay, so now, by the way, how are we going to model these? Well, Safran has a really good way to model them. There's something called the risk mapping tab in Safran, and one of the things is that this is a collaboration with the scheduler. And so you would say, Mr. Scheduler, Madam Scheduler, would you please have a column, this was user text 1, where you give me some kind of code so that I can isolate the phases and the activities that go along with those phases when I'm doing my risk mapping. And so then you go into the schedule, you go into the risk mapping, and you say, okay, I'm going to go into the schedule. I'm going to activate the auto filter. Here's the auto filter up here. And then I call for, let's say in this case, fabrication. I call for all those that are coded 4, or fab if you want, whatever the scheduler has used. At that point, you get all the risks. You go back to the risk mapping phase, and you got all those risks in there. But when you use the filter, only the risks that show up are the ones that you filtered in. So only these risks down here, activities down here would be the only ones showing up in the risk mapping phase for that particular filter. So now that could be 100 activities. There could be 100 activities that were coded that way. But in mapping, if you filter it correctly, then you can focus on only those activities that have the right code according to what you and the scheduler worked out. At that point, you say, okay, look, guys, there are 2 options. One is, yeah, every one of them, the whole phase is what I talked about. And somebody say, well, I like all those fabrication things, but the topsides drilling, the topsides central processing plant fabrication is the most exciting, and that's being done by a different crew, and they're not having this trouble. Well, then don't click that. But you can click all of them, or you can click selectively. But at least you are faced with the activities that you talked about when you decided that where am I here? You decided that you were going to have a risk associated with fabrication, 10 months for as many risks as there are in the schedule. Okay, so that's really interesting. By the way, look at this. This is my systemic risk number 110. This one happened to be named something about the weak project team, which is another systemic risk, and that just affects everything until you get it solved. Any risk that any risk in this schedule, including procurement, for heaven's sakes, that's going to be done by somebody else, or fabrication can be done by somebody else. But your team is so weak that it might very well affect the duration. Okay. So now I'm going to apply the risk, the application of the risk driver to all fabrication activities. And when I do that, I want to show you how you can convince people that you are being faithful to what the interviewee said. Remember, I had this, and I don't worry about the probability now. I'm talking about the impact only. 93% is the optimistic 108 is the most likely, 132 is the pessimistic. Okay, now I go in here and I say, does applying the consolidated risk data to all, but not other activities or not other risks. So just run a simulation selecting only the fabrication risk, the 10 months fabrication risk. Since we're working on the impact, set the probability to 100% because we want to simulate this thing in simulate it for the fabrication risk affecting fabrication and for just for the impact. So let's not mess up the results of the simulation by also trying to figure out what's the 75% likelihood. Okay, then you simulate, and then you choose the duration tab and watch what happens. This makes clients happy to show how the interview data are used. This is the duration of the fabrication phase based upon what? Based upon 93, 108, 132, which was based itself on 5 people's interview. And so you look at this and you look at the duration, the minimum is 283 over 300, which is the duration, which is 94, which is close to 93. The most likely is 326, which is the mode. That's 109%. Well, we said it was going to be 108%, so that's pretty clear. The maximum is 396. We're back here on the maximum. So that's 132. And in fact, what we said we were going to be using for the entire fabrication was 132% for the maximum. So fundamentally, you're saying this is how we collect data on risk drivers. This is how we map data to risk drivers. And this is how the risk drivers handle that kind of information. And this is handling it as the average of the 5 interviewees said. Okay, so risk drivers will reproduce the input for the data gathering process. That's what you've just demonstrated. And if you went into something and you said, okay, here are the days added, very unlikely will that reflect the information in the qualitative risk analysis, for instance. So one of the things is that when the exciting part of risk drivers is when you're using multiplicative factors, you can easily assign the same factor to large activities and short activities, long activities and short activities. And the last thing here, and then you get this kind of a result. And that's exactly what I advertised during the interview. Here it is. Proportionality is your friend when you're using risk drivers and when you're applying risk drivers to activities. Now, by the way, I was not telling it to impact independently. That was not not selected in any one of my risks, but particularly for that one risk. You see here's the histogram. Here's a cumulative distribution. I've highlighted the 80th percentile. What is this bimodal distribution? That is my systemic risk is 20% likely to have 50% or 40%, 50%, 60%, whatever. And that happens, but only if you do not force independence onto the modeling of this. If you do force independence, well, I got the 80th percentile in October 13th, 2030. Now it's October 16th of 2030 with forcing independence. But look, I've lost the extra mode for the risk for the systemic risk. This is to be explained. Okay, now having said I'm going to do this, I'm going to use risk drivers. The impact, the only difference is that the impact is based upon the multiplicative factors affecting being applied to the to the scheduled duration or the remaining duration. Those activity assigning the risk drivers to multiple activities, those activities become correlated in simulation automatically. And here's what I showed. I had one risk here affecting activity 1, activity 2, and I did, I don't remember, 5,000 iterations, I guess. And all of a sudden, if that's all that's happening, activity 1, activity 2, their durations will be correlated. If one is high in its range, then the other will be high in its range. If one is low in its range, the other will be low in its range. Pretty much automatically. I mean, this is the only influence that's going to happen on those two things. They are being shown now. Again, acting independently. Nope. I want him to if 107 is selected on one iteration, I want 107 to be applied to activity 1 and activity 2. And this is the scatter diagram from Safran, and you see the Pearson's correlation coefficient is 100%. This is just a line when the duration of activity 1, design 1 is scored on the x-axis, design 2 is scored on the y-axis, and they are in lockstep with each other, very highly correlated, 100%. But you say, well, okay, that's sort of cool. But what about if you have two other risks? These are called confounders. Here's a risk that affects only activity 1, but not activity 2. Here's one that affects activity 2, but not activity 1. Put your hand over the thing in yellow and tell me what you think the correlation is between activity 1 and activity 2 in this situation. Okay, now raise your hand if anybody said it was 38%. Well, I don't know how many of you raised your hand. Well, there's somebody who raised his hand. And that's that's fun. The Pearson correlation is 38. This is still the duration of activity 1. This is duration of activity 2. Activity 1 has a duration, say 52 days, but there are a lot of different possibilities for activity 2, and like that. So, or activity has 55 days, but there are a lot of different numbers for activity 1. So they're not fully correlated, but who would guess 38%? As a matter of fact, do you have any data that shows what the correlation is between two activities durations? Let's say that you don't know, but you're in a room with 7 other people, and you are trying to fill out a correlation coefficient matrix, and Safran offers you the opportunity to do this. The correlations have to be done pairwise. Activity A is correlated with activity B. Activity A is correlated with activity C. Activity A is correlated with activity D. Activity is 2. B is correlated with activity 3, activity 4, etc. There are a whole lot of pairwise comparisons that you have to make in order to fill out that correlation coefficient matrix by hand. Guess what? I got 38% automatically just from simulating, and it reflects the structure of the risks and how they affect individual activities, and it is automatic. The thing is, this correlation between the activity D can cause correlation is important. That's what this slide's all about. Correlation is important. Everybody knows correlation is important. Nobody knows what correlation is, or what value to give correlation between activity 1 and activity 23, or activity B and activity Z. So now correlation don't be important. Its applications always require analysts to estimate correlation coefficients between pairs of activities, usually in specialty workshops. And guess what? These are difficult. And so let's just go to the next slide. So for instance, I say a group of estimators think the activity in A and activity B are correlated 90%. They all say that A and C are correlated 80%. However, sitting in the same room, the same people cannot find much correlation between B and C. So they say 20% for that. Now, you will immediately say, wait a minute, if these are pretty high, 90% and 80%, then B and C have got to be correlated more than 20%. Come on. Or if you really think B and C are not correlated, how the dickens did you get them both correlated with A at these high levels? And now I'm going to get into a little mathematical jargon, and believe me, I'm not a mathematician. But at one point, I was in a room at the Air Force base in Los Angeles, and we had 7 people in the room, and we had a 7x7 correlation matrix, and we started to fill it out. And when at the end of filling it out, I came across something like this. It was not all that much more complicated than this, but there were correlation coefficients that didn't make sense. You know, if these are high, then that's got to be higher than 20%. And I had that, and so I talked to the guy who was driving it, a guy named Steve Book. And Steve Book was a PhD mathematician and spent a lot of time on cost estimation and all that, and liked to talk about correlation. And so I said, Steve, these 2 correlation coefficients are too small. They're too small because these other ones are larger. And he said, all right, well, he copied down the 7x7. We didn't fill out all the cells. We'll fill out a number of them. So he took it down the hall to another office, which had a computer that had MATLAB in it. And about half an hour later, I mean, it took him a while, he came back and said, David, you're right. Those things are not consistent with each other because as it's taken as a system, they can't be that much different. And on the other hand, the good news is I didn't have to change them very much to show a consistent correlation coefficient matrix. And what he did, it's apparently well known in mathematical circles, was to say, okay, what is the eigenvalue test? I think what it says is that the correlation coefficient matrix has to be positive semi-definite. And now I promise you, I don't know what I just said, but I think what that means is that it can't have negative eigenvalues, and I think eigenvalues are determinants. So that and this is because of the nature of a correlation coefficient matrix. If you have ABC up to let's say up to 20 activities on the vertical axis and 20 activities down the horizontal axis, the correlation of A with A is 100%. The correlation of Z with Z is 100%. And so down the principal diagonal, the correlation coefficient is 1.0 on every one of those cells. And then if you go on the left and you say, what is activity D and activity E are correlated, they're correlated 73%. Well, you go on to the other side of the determinant and of the principal diagonal, and those two are backwards. So if D and C are 70% on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, C and D are also 70%. And so you've got a very, very strict rule about what that correlation coefficient matrix ought to look like. Correlation used in reality by using risk drivers applied easily, because you're using risk drivers, applied easily to multiple activities is clearly better than introducing no correlations or assigning one coefficient to all pair of activities, or trying to estimate correlation coefficients pairwise. And I think I said on a previous slide here, my case study of 15 activities, the number of pairs that would have to be looked at for correlation is 105. Now you want to sit in there with a real schedule, and all of a sudden it's impossible to figure out what are the correlations pairwise between the activities. 1 with 2, 1 with 3, 1 with 4, 1 with 5, 2 with 3, 2 with 4 with 5, etc. And so some people say, well, I know that correlation is important, and I don't have a clue as to what the correlation coefficients are supposed to be. So I'll put 60% in. I remember a project a couple of years ago. They put 60% in for everything. And Stafford will let you do that. But you don't have any data. I don't know of any real data that is going to help you very much identifying correlation coefficients. So the best way to do it is to say, look, correlation is caused by, in reality, by using is the way correlation is caused in reality is using risk drivers. The fact that they use the multiplicative factor makes it easy to apply risk drivers to all the activities. You're not trying to add days, which means it makes it very difficult to apply drivers to days, and so to drivers to multiple activities. So you probably don't do it. And then you're forced with trying to estimate correlation coefficients because they're important. Correlation coefficients by themselves. And I remember one project where we had done the project, and this is in the United States government organization where there's a government accountability office. The GAO, Government Accountability Office, evaluates various projects that are of high value or high visibility according to assignments given them by the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives or the Senate. And so we were giving a presentation. And at one point, the woman who was there, Karen Ritchie, was there for GAO. She just asked the question, well, did you consider correlation? Now, this is GAO calling. I mean, if GAO is going to give you a bad mark for not considering correlation, you are a very sad person because GAO is very important. They're talking to your financiers, namely the congressional, the U.S. Congress of representatives and senators. And I said to her, I said, Carol, I didn't say Carol, I said, Karen, we used risk drivers. And she says, oh, okay. Now, how many of you on the people who are very likely, or have the power to write a public report or a report to somebody important saying you didn't do a very good job on your risk analysis, how important is it for you to get somebody saying, oh, okay, that's good? I mean, wouldn't that be just a marvelous thing to happen to you rather than trying to argue and defend what you did, yeah, that's because I taught this course. I taught a course to them 3 times at GAO. So in summary, because the risk drivers have impacts expressed as multiplicative factors of the scheduled durations and they impact specific activities or phases, they can be applied to all activities they affect. All of a sudden, you have a bunch of activities that are where their distributions, their durations are correlated. And of course, if it's only just that one risk affecting 20 activities, they are 100% correlated. But it is the case that you have 50 risks or 40 risks or 20 risks or however many risks you have. Each one of them can affect. There will be some that will affect the entire phase, and others that will affect part of the phase, but not other parts of the phase. So the correlation coefficient will be determined by that sort of capability. So you'll have some activities that are impacted by 2 risks, and some impacted by 1 risk, but not the other risk. And so the correlation coefficients get calculated during simulation. And this man who, as I said, unfortunately he died. His second heart transplant finally gave out with him. He was at his computer working on a report, and apparently he died when his second heart failed. Second replacement heart failed. And that was just terrible. But he promised he did the analysis and gave a report at a NASA conference to show that if you apply the risks this way, either cost or, he promised me, also scheduled, that you will always get a consistent correlation coefficient matrix. It'll always be positive semi-definite if that's the correct term. They will never have negative determinants if that's the correct term for eigenvalues. Because you're generating correlation, the way correlation is generated in real life, namely something that's valuable, something that is variable, is affecting two different things. It is variable, it affects their duration. It affects the durations and all that. So that's the sort of thing that we're talking about, and the impact, the and the yeah, I'm getting okay. So that's the way that using risk drivers, particularly, and the only difference is with respect to the type of impacts that are being used, allows you to deal with risks that affect multiple activities. Sometimes they affect only one activity, but sometimes multiple activities. Sometimes whole projects if it's like the project team is not up to the task. So that's what I want to talk about, and that's why it's important to use risk drivers. Is that everything is made so that you can deal with risks. You can apply risks to all the activities affected, and the side benefit is that they become correlated, and they always develop uh, correlation coefficients that are mimic the way correlation is generated in reality. I'm not saying that the correlations that are generated are in fact the exact correlations between those pairs of activities, but we are doing it the way it happens during real life, and therefore it's going to have some kind of relationship, and maybe a close relationship, to what the correlation coefficients are. Certainly would be better than not using correlation at all. Certainly would be better than using 0.6 everywhere, and all that. So that's what I wanted to say. Okay, thank you. And I don't have any idea. Yeah. Okay. So I went a little bit over. So thank you very much. But that's what I had to say. And Steve, do you have? I I don't know whether I can hear you because you haven't spoken yet. Do you have any questions that maybe I can
Can you
answer?
hear me, Dr. Hulett?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. All right. First of all, I want to thank you for such an amazing and interesting webinar today. A lot of great information. We look forward to your next webinar in the series, number one, as well as your presentation on July 1st at the Vegas Summit. So look forward to all of that. There's been a ton of questions today. Some of them we're probably not going to, many we're not going to be able to get to because of time limitations. But to let everybody know, anybody who is registered will get a copy of the recording when it's ready, plus any of the questions that are answered. And if you would like, Dr. Hewlett, I can send you the list of all of the questions and who asked them for your
Yes,
follow-up. So
that's fine. I may be able to maybe to give short answers to a large number of questions, and I appreciate the fact that what I said generates questions. That's a good idea.
there's a lot of questions.
Well, yeah, give us a couple to think
So
about.
here's one. Are there any definitive guidelines on how to determine probability ranges?
No, I don't have definitive guidelines. Uh, I think what we're talking about is getting people who are, number one, interested in the project, number two, involved and knowledgeable about the project, and number three, put in a safe place where they can actually give what they really believe to be the probability in this case. And then that you treat them honestly and with the due honor that they have done. They come talk to you for 2 hours about probability as well as impact. And the probability, you saw what I did with that, but I don't know of any other source of that. It's got to be project specific, I think, and risk specific.
Okay, great. So What are the main criteria for a proxy schedule that should be built in order for a schedule risk analysis to be meaningful? Furthermore, does he recommend to use the proxy schedule rather than the fully detailed schedule?
I don't know what you mean by proxy schedule, but this is a really excellent question because, and something I'm getting was going to get into, and I probably will still get into it in a later session. What we are developing new information, new revision of 57R09 right now, and one of the things we are doing is to talk about uh, what are the important issues in scheduling for success in Monte Carlo simulation. And for instance, you might say, well, don't use too many lags. And you know what? Don't use any lags. Lags will persist in simulation no matter if you have mitigated the risk or whether the risk happened and you messed it up, so that you might very well be overestimating the risk if you use lags. If the lag is a real thing, then it probably is an activity. Change it into an activity, make finish to start logic, and but a lag cannot be risked. Therefore it is a static, and it's also persisting in every single iteration. So yeah, the way in which you do that is to say, okay, A and B, we want to put them in parallel, but we want A to work for 10 days before B starts. What is that 10 days? Make that 10 days an activity, which might be 10 or 12 or 14 days, whatever it is, if it's risk, and then have a finish to start on activity B, which can't start until that 10 days or whatever it turns out to be actually finishes. So the lag is not acceptable. Don't use date constraints. I know that your schedule ought to, or there are some aspects of your schedule, namely the benchmark schedule that the contractors are asked to construct. They're supposed to mimic the contract, and a lot of false scheduling is done to make sure that particular schedule does the contract, and the dates appear on the contract, which was developed before you had a risk analysis and before you even had a schedule. Oh, and by the and you know and by the way, your schedule is not going to be inclusive of everything because the contractor's not responsible for everything. So you have to include everything. That's another thing. And anyway, this revision that we're talking about is talking about developing what we call analysis schedules. That's the term that NASA uses. And the analysis schedules are going to be things that will be able to give you realistic answers to realistic iterations of combinations of risk every time. So that's a very good question, and I understand that Safran is coming out with a version fairly soon that will have a beefed up schedule warnings methodology. Right now, we have to go out to some other software packages to look at the problems with schedule logic and durations and float and stuff like that. But I think that we're all looking forward to what they are able to give us in the next version. Okay, next question.
Yes, we're very excited about the next version. So another question. If risk probability is greater than 50%, shouldn't we challenge the risk existence? I believe this shouldn't be the case as a risk, rather build it into the project plan and add an opportunity applied that X risk doesn't occur.
Well, I've heard that before, and I've heard of people saying, well, if it's an 80% risk, let's just make it 100% and put it into the baseline. I think we're better than that in terms of the ability to use sophisticated software to model things that are interesting. One of the things that you might ask is sort of a flip of that question is, what about these these high impact, low probability risks. Some people are calling them black swans, but that's improper. But high impact, that is, if this risk happens, you're really going to damage the company's reputation and all that. You don't want to do that. Enterprise risk management and all. On the other hand, if it's only 5% likely, and you're a company that wants the contingency to reflect the 80th percentile, for instance, the 5% likely risk is not going to affect your any of your reporting that goes along with the cumulative distribution in a probability distribution sense, and so will not even be listed. I think high impact, low probability risks ought to have a special place in your report, because I don't think it's going to affect many of your results. As I say, unless you're a 95% company, it's not going to affect many of your results. But at the same time, you're ending with something that could very well be important, and your report ought to say that. Okay, but I don't think there's a cutoff point. Well, we've got software that will deal with all that. I wouldn't want to overstate the likelihood of a risk, and if you put it into the baseline, you're going to use some of your mitigation. And we're going to talk about mitigation also in a later session. You're going to use some of your mitigation money, which is very scarce, and so I wouldn't do that automatically. Not with a something at 50%, but I've heard people say 80 or 90% do that. I just don't quite buy that.
Okay, understood. So real quick, just one housekeeping question. Dr. Hulett, do you mind if we send out the slides of your presentation to all the attendees as a follow-up? You don't have to answer that question now.
No, I'm thinking, it is copyrighted.
Okay.
And I've had situations where other people have taken my copyrighted slides and take off the copyright and then use them for their own purposes. So I'm a little concerned about that.
Okay.
On the other hand, if there's some way that they can look at it online, that would be fine.
Okay, understood. All right,
Thank you.
another question for you. When you have a systemic risk and link it with every activity, how are you recording the impact?
Recording the impacts. First of all, the systemic risk has its own probability and its own impact, but obviously it's got wide application because it is systemic, and these systems. I mean, if you say I got a complex schedule, that's a systemic risk, and you're using new materials or new processes never been used at that scale before. That could very well be a systemic risk, and so you end up saying, okay, I'm gonna use that, but I'm gonna apply it to engineering because engineering has a lot of unanswered questions. I'm going to apply it to construction. I'm going to apply it to commissioning because a lot of errors can be found in commissioning and all that. So I think that that's the kind of thing that you'd want to be able to handle. I think risk drivers makes it much easier to handle. You may have situations where the systemic risk is a deal breaker. And one of the things that one of my other associates, Keith Hornbacher, and I have done is produce a recommended practice on using risk analysis at the earlier stages of the development of the life cycle of a project, where you're just still looking at analysis of alternatives. And your analysis of alternatives might very well be affected, at least, it might even be determined by the risk associated with one of those or another one of those. You don't even have a schedule yet. In fact, you don't have a project yet. That's exactly the point, that you don't have a project yet, and the project that you design has to be consistent with the kinds of things that are going on, and they may very well be systemic risk, and you want to use those early in the discussion. And that, by the way, gets management involved with risk concepts and with risk consequences, and therefore might make management more appreciative of the work of the risk analyst. Okay, so
Okay, great.
another one.
We have a lot more. We're only going to have time for this one last one. Then we're going to have
Okay.
to plug, unfortunately. So regarding risk sensitivity analysis, is the single pass option consistent enough in big samples, or does the multiple pass analysis produce better results, especially in
Hey,
case?
I don't have to give any more sessions, because that's another one of the sessions I want to give.
Oh,
This is about how do you do sensitivity analysis in a way that where you can say, yeah, if this risk were completely eliminated, I'd save 25 days, or I'd save 47 days, or I'd save 20 minutes, or whatever it is that the risk might do. And there are two, well, there's some traditional stuff that is based upon correlation. I don't much like that, but there are two methodologies in Safran that that require you doing multiple simulations. You do one simulation to find out what the P80 or P70 or whatever, and then you say, okay, if this is the P80 with all the risks associated, P80 is what I want. Let me take one of the risks out, and when I take one of the risks out, then I rerun the simulation. Now, the simulation, one of the beauties of Safran is that it goes so fast that you can run simulations like this with a lot of iterations and find out, well, did the number of days or the date the number at the P80, did you save 20 days or 10 days or 50 days or whatever it is? Okay, well, that's the impact of one risk, but you put it back in and you run another simulation, full simulation, taking another risk out, and then you calibrate however many days were saved if you take that other risk out, and you compare them. And the one that has the most days saved if you take a risk out might very well drive you, to understanding which risks ought to be top of the list in a mitigation workshop.
So Dr. Hulett, I do apologize for interrupting, but your audio has really deteriorated for some reason. And we have a very hard stop in about 10 seconds. I don't know if this is going to turn off for me or what, unfortunately, but I wanted to thank everybody for your time and your attention today. Like I said, I'm going to send all this information to Dr. Hulett so he can follow up with you directly. If you have any questions of me or any of our team, please reach out to us directly. We're always happy to help. So thank you all again for your time and interest.